If you've always been an individual contributor, your first day as a technical leader might be quite daunting. You might instinctively want to reach for an IDE, write some code, review some pull requests. And whilst I recommend familiarising yourself with the code at some point, I don't think that should be your immediate priority. You're no longer being judged based on your individual output as a technical leader. You're based on the performance of your team or teams. So what should you do on your first day as a technical leader? Well, that's what I'm going to go through in this video, so stay tuned. Figuring out what management expects of you. Are there any KPIs that are attached to your team? How have your team been performing in the last few months? If not so well, figure out what KPIs they haven't been achieving and why. If there aren't any KPIs, figure out loosely what your team is working towards. Is it a project? Is it some sort of deadline? I'm sure there will be, and I think then at some point in the next few months, it's worth sitting down with management and actually coming up with some KPIs. If management feel like your teams need to improve, make a note of those things. It's also worth figuring out whether management have any KPIs for you personally. Don't worry if they don't. They might not, but it's always worth making sure you understand the full extent to which your performance is being tracked. You probably won't action any of these immediately, but it's worth making notes of your observations over the coming days and weeks. Next thing, getting the lay of the land. What does your team actually do? Both from a product and technical perspective. I think part of this information gathering will require that you talk to other people. It's important to note here that the members of your team might have a very different view to other stakeholders within the business. Remember, members of your team will likely be individual contributors, and so they'll have their own view of the world that they work within. But you're one level above now, and so what you should really be doing is talking to other senior technical leadership. It could be CTOs, principal engineers, architects, and try and establish where your teams fit within the system. Also worth talking to senior product leadership to figure out where your team fits in within the product boundaries. You want to be able to point to a system architecture diagram and say, my team or teams take care of this part. And likewise, within the product diagram, you want to be able to point to that bit and say, this is what I am responsible for, or this is what my teams are responsible for. You never want to be in the position where someone turns around to you and says, but your team should have been taking care of this. That means that you failed in your oversight. And that's why I really encourage you in the kind of first days to figure out what is the scope of responsibility. The other thing you might want to do is actually figure out how your team interacts with other teams. Is there a separate QA team that you need to interact with? Is there a separate DevOps team that you need to interact with for deploying, for continuous integration? Figuring out what the release processes are. Ultimately, it'll be down to you to manage these things. If you have a delivery and you haven't figured out how the release process works, well, this might cause some serious issues. There might be a weekly release cycle, for example, that you're not across. It's these things that you need to establish and understand in the early days. Make sure that there aren't any private or back channels between more senior external stakeholders and people in your team. These are quite common. I've seen them a lot where someone senior has a friendly relation with someone in your team, which is great, but they leverage that and they use that to message them individual requests. Everything should be coming through you. You should be across everything that your team are working on. Otherwise, this really breaks down the organizational structure and ultimately leaves you in the dark about what your team are working on. So make sure that these kind of things aren't happening. Again, with reference to reporting structure, it's worth having an in-depth one-to-one with each of the members of your own team to see what they think is going well, what's not going well. It's also worth figuring out what is the structure of a team, who's senior, who's not. These are worth penciling in outside of your usual one-to-ones, but perhaps in the first week as a longer, in-depth one-to-one. Finally, it's worth figuring out what the goals are of the team over the next 3 months. It's worth asking your team members whether or not they're comfortable with these goals, and if not, figure out why. Your team might feel like they need to hire someone with specific knowledge, or they might just need more people in the team. These are worth noting down and going back to management with. First days as a technical leader will be largely writing things down, writing your observations down, and perhaps not improving things immediately, but optimizing things in the coming weeks. Lastly, familiarizing yourself with the code. I did start off this video by saying you probably shouldn't do that initially, but that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't do it at all. The best way to figure out how the product works, how the code works, what the processes are by monitoring the PRs and helping with reviews. You'll be up to date with what's going on in the team, and you might not necessarily have time to write code yourself. Get yourself set up locally as well. It's an interesting task in itself. It shows a lot about the team's documentation, onboarding, setup processes. It gives a good reflection of how the team operates if they have up-to-date documentation for people onboarding. If you do have capacity, pick up some small tasks which aren't time sensitive to better understand the developer experience and processes. Other things you can do, have a look at the backlog, see how well organised it is, see what kind of cadence the team has been operating at, make a note of who looks to be a good performer and who doesn't, observations at this moment in time. So to summarise, not all of these things you'll be able to complete on your first day, but you'll also be able to get the ball rolling on a number of them, setting up meetings with team members and external stakeholders, starting to get yourself set up locally, starting to look at PRs and the backlog. It's not to say you'll get them all done, you might not even get any of them done, but it's worth bearing in mind that these should be your objectives for the first few days, few weeks. They say it takes people 6 months to become effective. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think it's important to take a step back and realise that on your first day, on your first week, your first month, it'll be more about getting up to speed, writing down observations, creating a narrative in your head of how this team works and what you can do to improve it, rather than actually coming in and commanding radical changes immediately. Lastly, don't fear if your imposter syndrome gets the better of you on your first day. This will only subside as you become more familiar with your new territory. Have fun. Are you looking to grow your team? Why not give Voliyo a try? Whether it's great engineers, leaders, or just a bit of advice, we're always happy to help.